The record companies really, really do conspire against their artists. They steal, they cheat, they do whatever they can, especially the black artists. Tommy Mottola, the president of the record division, he is a mean, he's a racist, he's very, very, very devilish. I really believe it's a conspiracy because the story always ends the same. At the end of the story, it's not an accident. It's happened on purpose.
3 weeks before Michael Jackson died, he told his bodyguard that Sony was going to kill him for his music catalog. Those weren't the paranoid ramblings of a troubled celebrity. Michael Jackson understood something most people never realize about the music industry. When you sign a record deal, you're not just selling songs, you're selling ownership of your voice, your melodies, your legacy, and in Michael's case, he sold it to a company that would eventually own the most valuable music catalog in history. The story starts in 1985, when Michael did something unprecedented. He bought the ATV catalog for $47.5 million. This wasn't just any collection of songs. This was the Beatles. Paul McCartney himself had told Michael about the investment potential of music publishing during their collaboration on Say Say Say. McCartney owned rights to musicals like Grease and A Chorus Line. He casually mentioned that owning publishing rights was where the real money lived. Michael listened. Paul didn't know his friend was about to outbid him for the crown jewel. 4,000 songs, Northern songs, Lennon and McCartney compositions that generated millions in royalties every single year. Michael became the sole owner, and Paul McCartney stopped speaking to him. But here's what Michael didn't calculate. By becoming the most powerful music publisher in the world, he just painted the biggest target on his back that Sony had ever seen. And they were patient. Because Sony doesn't just buy catalogs. Sony waits until you need them more than they need you. By 1995, Michael Jackson was drowning. The child molestation allegations had gutted his public image. His album sales were slipping, he needed capital, and he needed credibility. Sony came to him with a deal that looked like a rescue. They would merge their music publishing division with Michael's ATV catalog, creating Sony/ATV, 50-50 ownership. Michael would get $95 million up front, and they'd share the profits from this new empire. Michael thought he was being clever. He kept half. He stayed in control. But here's the thing about joint ventures with corporations. They don't need majority ownership to control you. They just need you to depend on the infrastructure. Sony now handled administration, licensing, accounting. Every dollar that flowed through the catalog went through Sony systems first. Michael owned 50%, but Sony controlled 100% of the machinery. And the catalog kept growing. Sony/ATV started acquiring more publishing rights. Hank Williams, Patti Page, Lieber, and Stoller. By the 2000s, this wasn't just the Beatles anymore. This was a publishing empire worth billions, and Michael's half was his only real asset. Everything else in his life was mortgaged, leveraged, buried in debt. So when Michael needed money again in 2001, guess who offered him a loan? Sony gave him $200 million. The collateral was his 50% stake in Sony/ATV. You see where this is going. Michael didn't just owe Sony money anymore. He owed them his only leverage. And the interest was piling up. 7% annually on $200 million. That's $14 million a year, just in interest payments. Michael's lifestyle cost him between $30 and $50 million annually. His albums weren't selling like they used to. The math was impossible. But what Sony really wanted wasn't just the catalog, they wanted Michael's own master recordings. This is the part most people miss. Michael didn't just own half of the Beatles. He also had signed one of the most complex recording contracts in music history with Sony's label, Epic Records. That contract gave Sony ownership of his master recordings, but Michael negotiated unprecedented royalty rates, between 18 and 25% depending on the album. For context, most artists get 12 to 15%. Michael was taking a bigger cut than almost anyone in the industry. But those royalties only mattered as long as the albums kept selling. And by the mid-2000s, Michael hadn't released a major studio album since 2001's Invincible. That album's promotion was a disaster. Michael accused Sony's CEO Tommy Mottola of racism, of sabotaging the marketing. He called Mottola the devil. He showed up to protests with signs that said Sony kills music. The relationship was nuclear, but Michael couldn't just walk away. He was contractually obligated to deliver more albums, and Sony owned everything he'd already made. Thriller, Bad, Dangerous, History, every note, every vocal take, every unreleased demo sitting in the vault. Michael performed those songs. Michael wrote many of them. But Sony owned the recordings themselves, in perpetuity, forever. And when Michael died, those masters became even more valuable than the Beatles' catalog he'd fought so hard to keep. Because dead artists don't renegotiate contracts, dead artists don't demand creative control, dead artists generate pure profit. June 25, 2009. Michael Jackson died of acute propofol intoxication. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The official story is medical negligence. An addict who couldn't sleep. A doctor who enabled him. But 3 weeks before he died, Michael told his bodyguard Fahim Muhammad something chilling. He said, "They're going to kill me for my catalog." He meant Sony. Whether you believe that's literal or metaphorical, what happened next is undeniable fact. Within months of Michael's death, Sony made their move. The Jackson estate was buried in debt. Over $400 million owed to various creditors. The estate needed cash immediately to avoid complete financial collapse. So in March 2016, Sony bought out Michael's 50% stake in Sony/ATV for $750 million. The Beatles, Elvis, Bob Dylan, Taylor Swift's early catalog before she bought it back. All of it, now fully owned by Sony. The company that Michael had accused of trying to destroy him now controlled the publishing rights to the most valuable music collection ever assembled. And they paid the estate less than what the catalog was actually worth, because the estate had no negotiating power. They were desperate. But that's only half the story, because Sony already owned Michael's masters. And in death, Michael Jackson became the highest-earning dead celebrity on Earth. In the first year after his death alone, his estate generated over $1 billion. The This Is It documentary, reissues of his albums, licensing deals, Cirque du Soleil shows. And every single dollar generated by his recorded music flowed through Sony because they owned the masters. The estate gets royalties, yes, but Sony gets the master ownership, and ownership is forever. Royalties are just permission to share in profits. Ownership is control. It's the right to decide how the music is used, where it's licensed, what commercials it appears in. Michael's children will receive money from his music for the rest of their lives, but they will never control his artistic legacy. Sony does. And here's the darkest part. Since Michael's death, Sony has released more Michael Jackson albums than Michael released in the last 15 years of his life. Michael, Escape, Scream, compilations, remixes, songs Michael never finished, songs Michael maybe never wanted released, his voice chopped up and polished and sold without his consent because he's not here to give it. You wanted to know if Sony owns Michael Jackson's voice forever? They do. Not metaphorically, legally, literally. Every recording session from 1975 to 2009, every vocal warm-up that was captured on tape, every half-finished demo, it all belongs to them. And because copyright law in the United States protects sound recordings for 95 years from publication, Sony will own Michael's voice until the year 2014 at the earliest. Your great-grandchildren will live in a world where Sony still controls Billie Jean. Michael knew this was coming. That's why he fought so hard to keep the publishing catalog. Publishing was the one chess piece he thought he could protect. But he underestimated how patient Sony would be. They didn't need to take it from him. They just needed to wait for him to need them more than they needed him. And when he died, the game was over. So yes, Michael Jackson told his bodyguard that Sony was going to kill him. Maybe he meant it literally. Maybe he meant they would destroy him financially and professionally until there was nothing left. Either way, he was right. Sony didn't just win, they inherited everything. The man who moonwalked across the world, who shattered every record, who became the biggest star in human history, died owning nothing of his own musical legacy. His voice, the instrument that changed music forever, belongs to a corporation. And it will belong to them long after everyone who remembers Michael Jackson as a living, breathing artist is gone. If you want to see more stories about the dark side of the music industry, subscribe to this channel. Because Michael's story isn't unique, it's just the most expensive example of what happens when art becomes property.